Hi, and welcome to another edition of Studio 411. I'm your host, Larry Dasilva. There's a term in the sport of baseball called a hot stove league. Usually that's a period of time, usually in the winter months, especially in the old days before all the mass media that we have now. Well, this is kind of like an all-stove hour. We'll be talking with a gentleman who has written a new book called Baseball's Game Changers. His name is George Castle. George is a veteran journalist, author, has covered Major League Baseball since 1980 and is the author of over a dozen books. Currently, he's also a historian for the Chicago Baseball Museum. He's appeared on a wide variety of radio and television programming from ESPN to CBS This Morning, in addition to his own weekly radio show that ran for 17 years called Diamond Gems. Baseball's Game Changers, published by Lions Press. And we welcome to Studio 411, George Castle. Hey, George, how are you?
I'll be glad to give all the information you want, Larry, as befitting 411.
There you go. So tell me, for starters, how did the idea come about with Lions Press to do the Baseball's Game Changers?
Well, in a nutshell, they wanted to do a series of books for all sports covering baseball, football, basketball, the people, events, and issues that changed each sport for better or for worse, and they contacted me to do Baseball Game Changers. I had done two previous books for Lions Press, Sweet Lou and the Cubs, which is their aborted World Series March in 2008. That was over quickly in the Division Series. And also, When the Game Changed, an oral history of 1970s baseball. A lot of the changes that I talk about in Baseball Game Changers took place in the 1970s. So I was a known commodity to them. It's an honor to be contacted by a publishing company to do a book, because usually you've got to pitch them until you're blue in the face.
Now, you talked about the run in 2008, if memory serves. Wasn't that the year that the Dodgers kind of upset the Cubs? That was Joe Torre and along with Manny Ramirez and company?
Yeah, they swept them 3 in a row, and the Cubs literally were nervous and jittery on the field. I was just shocked watching them. Literally, they needed adult depends out there after leading the National League with 97 wins, a dominating offensive team, and they just literally piddled away another chance to get to the World Series, and it was pretty shocking. And it's basically taken until 2016 for that franchise to recover with the rebuilding program engineered by Theo Epstein.
Now, before we get into our first game changer that we've selected, give us an idea again, when you were putting the book together, what did you constitute as a game changer? Again, I know there's some personalities, there's events, but kind of what does that encompass in this book?
It would have to be a person, an event, a development that changed the course of baseball history. Things would have been significantly different with this entity having its impact on the game and having a long-term impact. An impact, let's say, if it took place in 1920, still has an effect on the game, still has its pattern 100 years later.
Gotcha. Well, we'll start with one that, again, it's definitely a history lesson for many. I know I certainly wasn't around. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find many people that were at this point. But you cover the Black Sox scandal of 1919. Do you think that legalized gambling, I've heard some rumblings about that it may actually rear its head in terms of baseball. I don't mean like a Pete Rose type gambling or players gambling, but that there will eventually be kind of, let's say, an off-track betting situation where people, not necessarily at the game, will be able to bet on baseball as they are in horse racing and other venues?
You know, that doesn't light my fire. The issues towards gambling, the attitude towards gambling has changed. It's liberalized. Sure, if people want to bet on baseball, be my guest. It's a very unpredictable game. I wouldn't bet on baseball. I was advised not to. If Larry Dasilva wants to do a sucker bet with me where I know I'm going to win, I'll be glad to take your money. But I generally don't bet on baseball. As the bookie once told me in Wrigley Field in the late 70s, he was straight out of Damon Runyon. Baseball's too unpredictable.
There you go. We're looking at an image from an old newspaper back in the day. 8 White Sox players indicted as gamblers. Obviously, this event in 1919, which again, you tell us a little bit about it, was the White Sox were in the World Series that year. I mean, that literally nearly destroyed the game as people knew it then, correct?
Well, it was the culmination of something that was brewing for decades. Gambling had been rife in baseball. There were rumors of fixed games. There's a suggestion that the 1918 World Series between the Cubs and the Red Sox wasn't on the up and up. There had been another gambling scandal that had bubbled up in a Cubs-Phillies game in 1920. And William L. Veck, who is one of my game changers, Bill Veck's father, alerted everybody to it. And the investigation quickly shifted from the Cubs-Phillies regular season game to the previous year's World Series, where there had been a lot of rumors circulating, and the scandal broke in the open. It brought in a commissioner. It changed the face of the game. It purged gambling from the game, and it also hurt the White Sox. They became a stepchild in Chicago and impoverished a franchise that almost moved 3 times. They were transformed from a franchise that was #1 in Chicago to one that has now, it's certainly playing second fiddle to the Cubs in the post-World Series championship era. So it had some far-reaching effects both on the style of the game, the administration of the game, and the disposition of the White Sox in Chicago.
One thing I like about the book, and you just mentioned one there, was that up until that point there was no baseball commissioner. There's quite a few facts. We're going to bring a few out as we go along during the hour of things that I found great, because little tidbits and stories about places, events, and people that I didn't even know about myself. And I consider myself, you know, a pretty veteran baseball aficionado, and enjoy the game, obviously, after all these years. There's one you bring up in there about the alleged Leo DeRocher incident from 1969. Of course, that would have been during that heated pennant race with the Miracle Mets. Mets wound up winning the pennant, won the division against the Braves, and then beat the Orioles in 5 games. Tell us about that Leo the Lip DeRocher story as you know it.
Well, there's another. I've investigated that for a book on Cubs management and ownership. There's been subsequent books about that. Bowie Kuhn, it looks so suspicious with Leo DeRocher's background associating with gamblers and all sorts of underworld figures, the George Raffs and all that, rumors about Leo gambling. When Leo had some very unusual moves, and he literally had what I can't say, I will call a brain fart as far as managing the Cubs down the stretch in '69. He did everything wrong, played his regulars into the ground, and the moves that he made during the Black Cat Series, September 8th and 9th, 1969 at Shea Stadium, obviously Commissioner Bowie Kuhn was there. He didn't like what he saw. There were a lot of rumors that Leo was in hock, $50,000 on a gambling debt. And so Kuhn, the Chicago Tribune, the Better Government Association in Chicago, 3 or 4 different investigative bodies looked into Leo during that subsequent offseason, and none could pin anything on him. But it really looked suspicious, and the collapse of the '69 Cubs certainly haunted that franchise. And it still will haunt people even after the World Series. Anybody who lived through that will take that to their graves. That team had 4 Hall of Famers and should have won that division, but it just seems that something there's no explanation for it, and that they looked at Leo DeRocher as somebody who might have crashed that team. If it was indeed true, that would have been a second Black Sox scandal. And in fact, Bowie Kuhn asked Chicago columnist Rick Talley not to publicize the probe as it was going on for the good of baseball. And Talley agreed. That would never happen today in journalism.
I was going to say, yeah, it's a whole other world. And of course, you mentioned the black cat. That was the one where stories abounded about someone let a black cat maybe from the stands, and it walked near the Cubs dugout. Again, you wonder how staged that may have been. But Leo, of course,
there was a black cat in 2003 too at Wrigley Field. So it keeps recycling itself.
There you go. They must love the Cubs or love to sabotage them one way or the other.
Well, 2003 was another big screw up, but that's another book.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, Leo was suspended back in, I believe it was 47?
47, just as Jackie Robinson was about to make his debut.
And as I recall, Leo did not get into the Hall of Fame until the early 90s, and you wonder, after all these stories and suspicious activity, certainly a colorful gentleman, but you wonder if it didn't take as long as it did, partly because of some of the baggage that he carried with him.
I called him the most amoral man in baseball.
Wow. Oh,
He made a comment that was similar to President Trump's about contact with women's private parts. He made this to Roger Kahn in 1954. I'm not going to repeat it because there will be, this is a family show, but when Trump, the recording of Trump was revealed, it reminded me of what Leo had said to Roger Kahn. This man was a very crude and lewd individual, and unfortunately, he seduced Cubs owner Phil Wrigley into hiring him, thinking that he would revive the franchise, but he didn't take it to point A, that's for sure.
There you go. Journalist, author, historian George Castle joining us here for the hour on Studio 411. The book Baseball's Game Changers by Lion Press. George Castle has thrown a major league curveball with baseball's game changers. While the order can be argued, the logic behind his selections cannot be, unquote. That was Randy Myers, former Met, former early 90s Reds, nasty boy, relief pitcher, and all-time single-season saves leader with the Cubs. All right. Let's talk about Marvin Miller, another gentleman who I know, as we tape, has not yet been inducted into the Hall of Fame. I suspect that'll change in short order. But Marvin Miller, who was the first head of the Players Union, Red Barber and Fay Vincent both called Marvin Miller one of the most important men in baseball history. Educate us on Mr. Miller.
Well, it was not a fair fight when you had the former economist of the Steelworkers Union going up against egotistic owners who didn't know anything about legalities or labor relations. Marvin had a very, very good strategy. He bid his time, added one right at a time for the players, didn't go for the home run and try to get free agency in his first couple of years as head of the Players Association. He waited for the right time. He waited for a couple of people in Dave McNally and Andy Messersmith, and there had been a long ignored but present clause in a player's contract saying that a player could become a free agent if he did not sign a contract and then played the next year without a contract. Nobody ever paid attention to that little clause, but Marvin Miller did. He waited for his test case. He got free agency. He felt, rather than the players unilaterally imposing on it or the courts doing it, he wanted player rights to be achieved through collective bargaining, as he had done with the Steelworkers Union, because that way it would have the effect of permanence, sort of like Lincoln pushing through the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery, rather than just relying on the Emancipation Proclamation, a wartime measure. So Marvin Miller was literally the smartest man in baseball, should have been commissioner, and every player making $20 or $30 million today and having free agent rights after 6 years, should thank his lucky stars that Marvin took the job under less than ideal circumstances in 1966.
And if I recall in the book, even Richard Nixon, who I'm sure was not too keen on hiring probably someone with Marvin's background, even he showed him a little respect, you know, as far as his abilities with the labor market.
Well, Richard Nixon was out of a job then, or certainly out of power, and even he, as a baseball fan, and Nixon even wanted to be a sports writer at one point, he suggested that he should be the counsel for the Players Association, but certainly he didn't have the temperament.
Exactly. George Castle joining us here for the hour on Studio 411, the baseball, or the book rather, Baseball Game Changers by Lions Press. We'll move on to another interesting fact. Again, I had never knew this or never read this. We're going to talk a little bit about with George Jackie Robinson. Again, too much to encapsulate. I figure if a person doesn't know about Jackie by now, well, then maybe they might want to Google. But anyway, Jackie Robinson, in fact, I was not aware of, that in 1965, long after his playing days were over, was another first in his pocket, became the first black network announcer when ABC for a year had the ABC Saturday Game of the Week with Chris Schenkel and the aforementioned Leo DeRocher as his sidekicks. I read that a surviving segment, this is what amazes me, that in those days, even with the early days of videotape, very little was saved, and there was a gentleman somewhere who probably, did a kinescope or of a short segment of Jackie actually as a broadcaster, and that this was presented to his widow a few years ago, correct?
I'll run you through the story, Larry. A pair of brothers in Galesburg, Illinois, about 180 miles west of Chicago, John Ring, they were taping ball games off radio and also the audio tape of TV with a reel-to-reel recorder in 1963, 64, 65. And one of the tapes that they made was part of a Saturday afternoon broadcast, or I should say a Labor Day broadcast in 1965, Dodgers and Giants at Dodger Stadium. It was the first Dodgers-Giants confrontation since the John Roseboro incident, where Juan Marichal hit Dodgers catcher Roseboro on the head with a bat. And it was amazing because the tape at one point had been underwater, was oxidizing. I got a hold of it sometime in the late 1990s. We transferred it to cassette, saved it, and it was great because they taped the pregame show, and that's a collection of big names. Howard Cosell was interviewing Willie Mays and Sandy Koufax together. Then he saved a part of the actual broadcast, and that had the threesome of Chris Schenkel, Jackie Robinson, and Leo DeRocher. That was the job DeRocher had prior to becoming a Cubs manager in October 1965. So it was a rare piece of tape. Videotape in those days came in 2-inch spools, and they cost $600, and that was expensive. So unless an enterprising station executive or network executive took the reel of tape out of circulation, they were typically recycled for other programming, the most immediate needs to show a tape show, and they didn't think of saving it. With the technology we have, I have this tiny little phone that I'm broadcasting on. In 1965, there was a show called Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, Richard Basehart and David Hedison, and they projected picture phones, where you would dial up on a phone, and there would be a little TV screen next to it. Well, it didn't quite happen that way, but technology has really advanced. But in those days, not a lot of people put a premium on saving baseball tape. And I've had a side business or side passion of acquiring long-lost tape like this over the last 20-something years, and we probably have thousands of hours of it.
Wow. Amazing and kind of sad in many ways that the all that survived or actually was being accomplished was an audio, whereas you would think, well, how great would it have been to have a video of that. But anyway, as we move on, here's a quote from a gentleman I think everybody would know. "Every strike brings me closer to the next home run." And there's for sure another game changer, again, as far as personality, a player, etc. The immortal Babe Ruth. As we speak with George Castle here on Studio 411, the book Baseball's Game Changers. Babe Ruth, after his illustrious career, again, both as a pitcher in the early days and later as a slugger for the Yankees, of course, finished his career with the Boston Braves. And then I think Babe kind of thought, well, I'm going to just slide in and become a manager, and never really was given consideration for the Yankees job at any point. But you talk in the book how he just missed on becoming, I was reminded of Ralph Houck when he later on became a Yankee and then later a Red Sox and a Tiger manager. And I'm told that in your book that Babe could have possibly, maybe with a lucky break, had either one of those two franchises as his first job.
Well, I don't think any baseball executive seriously thought of Ruth as a manager. Even with all the relationships that he had in the game, it's obvious that he didn't have the relationship with the Yankees owners or general manager Ed Barrell. And his only on-field job, his uniform job, was 1 year as a Brooklyn Dodgers coach. This is before the Dodgers got good and at the dawn of the 1940s, and they were looking for a gate attraction. So that's the unfortunate thing. He had so much to contribute, but everything is about relationships, who you know, who you're politically aligned with, and for all his popularity, Babe Ruth just did not get aligned with the right person who could make him a manager. And it was very, very common for players to go directly to the manager's job. There are still quite a few player managers in the 1930s, but unfortunately, it wasn't to be for the Bambino. But cry not for him. He was not impoverished at all. He made a living being Babe Ruth, and he was sports' most outstanding personality. Not just it's for baseball's greatest slugger, but sports' most outstanding personality in his time, and that's why he's #1 in baseball game changers.
There you go. Spend a moment, if you would, talking about while reading the book, I was struck by the problem that I guess they brought upon themselves, the American League for many years falling behind the National League with regards to integration of players. Of course, we know the Yankees was 1955 before they had a African-American ball player, Nelson Howard. The Red Sox 59 with Pumpsie Green. And again, those were two of the more egregious examples in terms of the lateness when you consider Jackie Robinson had done it back in the late 40s. But
the Detroit Tigers, in a largely or very heavily African-American city, were also late. They did not have an African-American player. They had a Dominican player in 1958, Ozzie Virgil. But they did not have an African-American player till Larry Doby, the guy who had integrated the American League, came to the Tigers a short time at the end of his career in '59.
Wow. Amazing, you know, and then you wonder why later on in the 60s, 70s, until about the early 80s, all-star games, very heavily all-star games were quite, heavily favored for the National League, and certainly, I would say, a fair share of the World Series victories were also by National League teams, except for, a couple of periods with the A's and the Yankees in the 70s. But again, a lot of that was, I think, just people not being on the ball. And speaking of that, that leads me to our next game changer, someone who certainly did quite a bit for the National League and the teams he was associated with, Branch Rickey. Again, top tier importance, GM of the Pirates, the Cardinals, the Brooklyn Dodgers. And a couple of things there. What I learned from your book was that even though he was, during his tenure in the 50s, was not successful with the Pirates, he certainly paved the way with his work that he did so that by the late 50s and in 1960, they, with many of the players that he recruited and had a hand in developing, won the '60 World Series.
Yeah, the one thing that I'm it's never been answered to me is that if Ricky was aggressive in integrating the Brooklyn Dodgers in his previous job, why couldn't he have signed some of the Negro League players as the Negro Leagues were contracting in the early 50s to make the Pirates good right off the bat? I don't think there was anything in the racial climate of Pittsburgh that would have prevented him from doing so. The Pirates integrated very, very slowly with Branch Rickey at the helm and really didn't become known for their black and Latin players. They became the most colorful team, the first team to field an all black and Latin lineup September of 1971. Gene Clines once told me if you saw the number of black and Latin players in spring training for the Pirates in the late 60s, early 70s, it would scare you. They had to get rid of all these guys because they didn't have enough room for them. But that's strange how Ricky did not integrate the Pirates. But Ricky's longest lasting impact is not just Jackie Robinson, it's the creation of the farm system.
Exactly.
And he did that because the Cardinals didn't have the money to sign star players, which is the common way of acquiring talent, to sign star players off of minor league teams. So basically, groom hundreds of your own poorly paid players and own the rights to them. He duplicated that in Brooklyn, and that's the reason why, when we go back to the Cubs issue, that's the reason why they lagged and had this long championship drought, because their farm system couldn't measure up to most other teams. They were late in developing a farm system, and they certainly couldn't match those of the Cardinals and Dodgers, two of their National League rivals.
George Castle, author, journalist, sports historian, joining us for the hour here on Studio 411. The book, Baseball's Game Changers, by Lions Press. Again, let me read you another quote here real quick. Fred Lynn, 1975 MVP and also Rookie of the Year that year with the Red Sox. Quote, "I'm not a baseball historian, but I've lived through these chapters." George Castle pointed out a lot of things I didn't know. With this book, you will learn how the game became what it is today. Anybody who likes baseball is going to love baseball's game changers. And that's courtesy of Fred Lynn, who was quite a player in his day. Sticking with, again, some of the minority candidates and players that came up, especially in the 40s and 50s. An excellent segment you did on a gentleman who, Cuban-born, considered the Jackie Robinson of Latino ball players. I saw him really just at the tail end when he was kind of doing his little cameo appearances. But talk about Minnie Minoso. Talk a little bit briefly about the impact that Minnie had.
Well, there were actually Latin players going back to the beginning of the 20th century, but they were light-skinned Cubans. As one sports writer said, they were pure as Castilian soap. The black Latins were still barred from the major leagues. So you had some halting integration of baseball with Robinson and the Dodgers, a little bit with the New York Giants in the late 40s. Minoso, a black Cuban, very effervescent guy, tremendous athletic ability. He played in the Negro Leagues, and the Cleveland Indians signed him. They didn't have enough room for him at the time. They traded him to the Chicago White Sox, and in his first game, he had a home run off the New York Yankees. He became the first black Latin star in the majors in 1951, became a very effervescent guy. I think if he had played in New York, he would have made the Hall of Fame. He wanted to make the Hall of Fame late in life, just fell short in the old-timers committees. And without Minnie starring as he did, you might not have had such an easy path for a guy like Roberto Clemente, a black Puerto Rican, to achieve the fame and fortune that he did with 3,000 hits. His career, unfortunately, cut short a little bit by his tragic accident New Year's Eve 1972. So the Latin contingent, many of whom are dark-skinned, they considered to be black players, he was the role model for them. And all the Cuban players, certainly, who have come into the majors both in the first wave prior to Castro and a gathering wave in recent years, slipping out of the island by some, in many ways, terrible and corrupt means, they owe a lot of the debt of gratitude to Minnie Minoso.
One of the categories, again, that with any of these categories in George's book, again, there are always a slew of folks influential. They probably could stand on their own merits as well. But one of our next game changers we'll talk with George about is free agency. And we're looking at a photo probably from the late 60s. If you know your Christmas songs, you know the old cowboy singer Gene Autry. Well, there's a photo with Gene, who later became, in the early 60s, became the majority owner of the California Angels, Los Angeles Angels, later Anaheim Angels. We'll just call them the Angels, as you see Gene holding a banner from back in the 60s. The story that, again, I shook my head to show kind of sometimes how these owners would nickel and dime the players to death, and free agency in the late 70s was starting to take off. But again, he lamented letting Nolan Ryan, who had been with them for several years, go to the Astros for a 4-year, $1 million per year salary. And I guess
sounds quaint today, doesn't it?
Oh, exactly. It's the minimum, I think, is higher than that at this point. But
I don't think that. I think it would get a lot of publicity if the minimum was $100 or $1 million. I think the minimum's close to or over 400,000 now, but I certainly could stand a little bit of that minimum.
Absolutely, absolutely. But you know, Nolan, again, it's funny that he wound up going to a few other teams in his career, and of course, you know, never went back to the Angels there in Anaheim, California. And they're just amazed because they had some good teams then in the 80s. And if you recall, even that fateful series that they lost to the Red Sox back in '86, at the same time, over in the National League, the Senior League, Nolan Ryan is helping the Astros, along with Mike Scott and several others, to you know, almost get into the series, except they were stonewalled by the Mets, but a very close series there. And again, I guess things have changed now. It sounded like their GM might have been at the racetrack, but and these days now with technology, I'm sure everyone is accessible at any time when it comes to making trades and free agency.
Well, I can remember 10 years ago, cell phones were pretty established, not iPhones yet, but Cubs general manager Jim Hendry would walk around with literally the cell phone was his third ear. He'd go to his kids' Little League game, and he'd stand behind a tree with the cell phone. He'd never be out of touch. I think that's hilarious that when Lou Brock was traded to the Cubs in 1964, Cardinals general manager Bing Devine had to wait till his plane landed in Los Angeles and then ran for a payphone to call his counterpart with the Cubs, John Holland. That would be consummated a little bit faster today. But let me tell you one thing. It isn't just free agency that resulted in these high salaries. Even more so was television. And television showering the game with an ever bigger contract. The first multi-billion-dollar contract by CBS in the early 1990s enabled salaries to really skyrocket. The owners spent their TV windfall as soon as they got their checks. So I think that this is going to be the telling thing in the game going forward into the 2020s. If you don't have this TV rights bubble available, if all the cord cutters can continue to get rid of their cable packages and do a very much thing on demand, do streaming, the value of advertising won't be as great with this fractured up situation with media, Larry. So salaries may go backwards if the TV rights bubble doesn't exist in the 2020s.
Exactly.
That's the thing to watch out. That will be a massive game changer, as big as the entry into television, entry of television itself, which I rate as the #3 game changer, right behind Babe Ruth and Jackie Robinson.
George Castle, baseball's game changers, joining us for the hour on Studio 411. We're looking at a shot of a gentleman, and I mean that. I've had a chance to meet him on one occasion, a very nice gentleman. Took time to help me out on a charity event. Goose Gossage, and that leads us to our next game changer. Bullpen, as he says, specialization. Say that 5 times. A lot different way of using the bullpens, the bullpen arms these days than back in the history of the game. I know certainly Goose, which is one of the reasons I picked this image of him, was because you know, he's very proud of saying, well, I pitched 3 innings, you know, whereas Mariano and so many guys today and in the recent past are so specialized that if they have to go beyond 4 or 5 outs, you know, it's like a calamity. So, and part of that I think too is because of the money that's invested in these players.
Well, and we've seen a continual evolution just recently. If you look at the postseason in 2016, you have people like Terry Francona and Joe Madden bring their closers in earlier and earlier. They're not letting anything go to chance. The idea of a dominant starter even going 7 innings, 8 innings, is now out the window. Kyle Hendricks was pulled with 1 out, or I should say 2 out in the 5th inning, with a big lead in Game 7 of the World Series against the Indians in 2016. And everybody kept asking him all winter, why were you pulled? Why were you pulled? Managers are now desperate to win at the slightest hint of trouble. They're going to do things backwards and bring their closers in ahead of their setup men in these postseason situations, like in the World Series, pressure situations. And so now this is going to spread to other managers, and if they feel desperate enough for a win, instead of all these setup men, you're going to bring your closer in and pull your starter at no sign of trouble. Sure. I think it's amazing what's going on, but that's the pressure to win. Baseball, Larry, is the ultimate game of failure, and failure stalks everybody. And the pressure to win is just crushing right now. And this is why you see a further evolution of the bullpen, particularly in pressure situations like the playoffs and World Series.
Another game changer here to my left. I picked this gentleman because, again, he's mentioned in the book, and again, I thought he was a tremendous ball player back in the 60s and 70s. Another gentleman who unfortunately might have fallen short for the Hall of Fame, the great Tony Oliva, outfielder in his early days, later a DH after his serious knee issues. But again, the DH, another game changer in George's book. DH, you always hear, oh, we're going to get rid of it. We're not. What do you think? Here to stay?
Here to stay. I don't think you're going to purge the DH from all levels of baseball. It's been used at all levels of baseball except the National League. So I don't see any impetus. It's amazing that we've had replay. They resisted replay for so many years. Now they can't live without it. But the DH in the National League is just not imminent. I know that the Players Association would love to have the DH in the National League. That would mean a few more jobs for highly paid veterans. But I just don't see the impetus after now 45 years, 44
At
years
least,
since 1973 that it's being used. If it was going to be in the National League, it would have been in there already.
It lends itself to kind of seeing baseball from a couple of different perspectives. Real quick before we go to our next game changer, quick memory for me, 1973, Red Sox-Yankees, opening game of the season. I'm watching it on my television, and all of a sudden Orlando Cepeda was the DH in his 1 year for the Red Sox, and for the Yankees was Ron Blomberg, who of course was a better hitter than he was a fielder. And then real quickly on Tony Oliva, what was tragic about him in his later years was his knees were so bad that I remember games where he was penciled in as the DH. He would start the game as the first batter and then have to be removed because if he wasn't the DH, his knees couldn't, he was unable to go out in the field. So there's a gentleman that the DH certainly would have benefited and did benefit late in his career. So
a lot of players simply finished the last half of their careers as DH. If they weren't really adept fielders like Frank Thomas, it was fine for a team to just let a guy DH and be half a player. It used to be, according to Hal McRae and other players, a kind of knock on your baseball manhood if you couldn't be a two-way player and play the field back when the DH was put in the 70s. But it's so much of part of the game and so much a way of extending defensively weak players' careers. Look at David Ortiz. Nobody ever criticized him for not playing first base the last half of his career at the Red Sox. He became a much beloved player and an effective slugger to the very, very end.
George Castle joining us here on Studio 411. The book, Baseball's Game Changers by Lions Press. For more information, www.georgecastle.com. Another game changer, lights. Lights, first used in 1935, if I understand correctly. A thing I was not aware of, and George got into it a little bit in the book, spend a moment on that, was that the American League teams, again, Yankees, Red Sox, Tigers, so many more, and those were some of the bigger teams back in the day, took much longer to get on with the program. I couldn't believe that. Part of it could have been during World War II as well, but many of those teams did not get lights until after the war was over, circa 1945-46.
Well, yeah, and immediately after the war, there was an attendance boom with the returning servicemen, so there wasn't an immediate need to put in lights. But yeah, it was deemed necessary as attendance just really cratered out in the Depression. So they figured that those who were still lucky enough to have jobs certainly weren't going to take off to watch a ball game during the day, and so would come out at night. And there were restrictions on night games at the beginning. Again, baseball change often moved at a glacial pace, and things that we consider second nature, owners fought against and were adopted. Now, of course, the Cubs, they were a strange situation, a 40-year holdout against lights after the last team, the Tigers, installed them in 1948. That was an artificial ban by the eccentricities of owner P.K. Wrigley, who had originally planned to install lights in 1941, but when Pearl Harbor took place, he donated the Steel of the War effort, and yet during the war, he appealed to the War Department to install lights on wooden poles, and the War Department turned him down. He probably would have joined the crowd and put in lights after the war, but Cubs attendance boomed to 1.3 million, a big season attendance then in day baseball. So he just let the thing go. And so, but you cannot conceive of baseball being played during the day to any great extent anymore.
Another game changer you touch base on is the division and league championship series. Now, am I to interpret that perhaps the World Series now in some cases almost becomes anticlimactic and perhaps doesn't carry the same luster as it did when we were kids growing up?
The World Series is a national unifying force. Everybody would sneak radios into schools. If you were lucky enough, the teachers had a TV set and they would turn it on. It was that popular. It was a unifying force, and baseball did not care that some of the country would see the World Series at 10 a.m. They would start the World Series at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. 12 o'clock Central, and then 10 o'clock in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and the rest of the West Coast. But it was a unifying force. People would find ways to follow the World Series during the day. Eventually, they felt that it would get more viewers at night, and so the World Series became a primetime event in the 70s. And it was still able to command a huge national audience because you still had the three-network setup. Cable did not become truly national till the 80s, dividing up the audience more than it previously had been cut up. So you still had massive numbers for the World Series in that three-network setup. But with more channel choices, more programming choices, it began to die out a little bit in terms of total viewership, and then the World Series would be pushed back further and further in October because now you had by the late 80s, a 7-game league championship series. And then in the 90s, you had the divisional series. So now the World Series, by the time you get to it, it's almost viewer exhaustion. And it's no longer the national unifying force it was in the 60s. Our view of the World Series is based on a mid-20th century outlook. And, of course, it was huge here in Chicago because the Cubs hadn't won one in 108 years. But I think from that national audience standpoint, we're going on some outdated assumptions about the popularity of the World Series, given the fact it's pushed all the way into November now.
There you go. I think this next gentleman might be trying to call somebody. I don't know if that's on your end or mine, but anyway, our next game changer, Bud Selig, and the credit that for the changes of the 25 or so years that he was baseball's commissioner. I know some people like to vilify Bud, but again, I think in your book you try to look for the more the positive and what he had to deal with. Obviously, there's a chapter in there about the PEDs, et cetera, but on a positive note, I guess there were quite a few things that he helped usher in. Tell us a little bit about Bud Selig.
Well, Bud takes a lot of grief for supposedly presiding over the steroid era, looking the other way while people were pushing records to ridiculous numbers that will never be repeated again. 70 home runs, guys hitting 50-something home runs who never hit more than 25 in a season. Just remember, you had very, very serious labor problems, a very spectacular, almost game-killing strike. Present Supreme Court Judge Sonia Sotomayor is the federal appeals judge who put in an injunction to put baseball back in business in the spring of 1995. The Players Association was not weakened at all by that strike. And Bud Selig could not do anything initially. He could not put in drug testing by fiat. You had to have the union sign off on it. And you had to have the ridiculous performance and outlandish statistics and swollen melon heads by some of the, they say, round up the usual suspects, for the union to finally say, we've got to clean this up. But Selig could not run roughshod over the union and impose drug testing without their cooperation. So the game literally had to get ridiculous before the players would say we've got to police them, agree to police ourselves. And so it took a while before you could get that drug testing in there. So Selig takes a big rap about it. So do us people in the media. Unless we had a relationship with the DEA or the FBI, somebody who really had inside stuff about who were the PED suppliers and how these drugs were injected, we couldn't go into the trainer's room. We couldn't follow the players offshore during the off season. I would ask Sammy Sosa about people suggesting that he was not clean, and he just brushed me off saying, I'm just here to play baseball. What more was I supposed to do? So we circle back to the whole thing with Selig. He takes an awful lot of guff. I'm sure that there's some profiteering, some desire to maximize baseball's business, but he alone could not have unilaterally put a stop to the PEDs with the power of the Players Association. He did bring in a lot of reforms and innovations in the game. The structure of the playoffs, interleague play we have now was done at Selig's impetus, and he made more changes in the game than any other commissioner.
George Castle joining us for the remaining moments here on Studio 411. The book, Baseball's Game Changers by Lions Press. For more information, www.georgecastle.com. couple of minutes that we have left, talk about a section, game changer. You talk about Tommy John surgery. And for those who are not old enough to remember, Tommy John, a veteran left-hander who played, my goodness, he played almost 20, maybe a little over 25 years, but really the last 12 or 14 or so with what they call a newly bionic arm. And again, was with
no mileage on that arm, Larry.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, that's why he lasted as long as he did after being one of the first in the mid-'70s to have Tommy John surgery. Why the increase in pitchers' health issues over the last 10 to 15 years? It seems to be escalating. There's been several schools of thought. Leo Mazzoni, veteran pitching coach with the Braves, Nolan Ryan, veteran Hall of Fame pitcher. A lot of these guys feel, get out there and just throw the ball. But as you said earlier with managers, because there's so much money tied up in these players, that we seem to baby these arms. And sometimes I wonder who has the right track. Either use it or, limit your innings, limit your pitches. And sometimes I think when you're always looking over your shoulder, no pun intended, I think these issues seem to occur more.
Well, right now you have various youth sports associations trying to put pitch limits on high school pitchers. So things where pitchers were abused, they were throwing too much since the beginning of baseball were going on, arms were wrecked, and there was no advancements in sports medicine to save these guys. If your arm hurt, you injured yourself, you basically packed it up and went home and had to do something else. So we know a lot more about how the body works. We can fix it more. And so that's probably why we're reporting more and more injuries, because they're being diagnosed. I can tell you, I had the testimony of many players, many pitchers, who were afraid to lose their jobs in the 60s and would pitch through tendinitis. They might lose a pitch, but they would keep pitching and pitching and pitching, less effective. Sometimes they would come down with arm problems and break down, but they were the insecurity in baseball was so much that they would not reveal their injuries to even their trainers. And so that's how you had Ernie Broglio, whose elbow was starting to break down, but was concealing it from the Cardinals, getting traded to the Cubs for Lou Brock, and then breaking down probably the worst trade in baseball history.
Absolutely.
So we're knowing more about injuries just because our overall knowledge of how the body works has increased exponentially, and our ability to fix broken parts of the body. Let me give you a quick example.
Real quick. We're winding down, George. Real quick.
Yeah, I just had a hip replacement, and I threw away the cane within a month.
There you go.
So you can fix people a lot more quickly.
Very good. George Castle, able-bodied and moving at a rapid pace, I can tell you right now. Baseball's game changers, icons, record breakers, scandals, sensational series, and more. Published by Lions Press. For more information, www.georgecastle.com. George, we look forward to having you back on the program. Thank you so much for spending some time with us, and we look forward to seeing you again. Appreciate it.
Appreciate it, Larry. We could have danced all night, as
Absolutely.
they say.
Hang tight there for a second. And we thank you for joining us here on this week's episode of Studio 411. I'm Larry Dasilva, and we hope to join you again very soon. Have a great day.